So a big welcome to Michael O'Kane, who is our next speaker. And Michael joins us as part of our webinar on how to start your international career as a lawyer. And he will be drawing off his extensive and fascinating career and a little bit about Michael before I hand over to Michael. So Michael leads the firm and the business crime team as senior partner with Peters & Peters, one of UK's leading law firms in business crime, commercial litigation and compliance, and is based in London. Michael has acted for companies, senior executives and high net worth individuals in many of the most high profile and complex national and international business crime cases. He has particular expertise in international corruption, criminal cartels, financial sanctions, Interpol, extradition and private prosecutions. Before joining Peters & Peters, Michael was a senior specialist prosecutor at the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, in their headquarters. There, he was a key member of a small specialist unit responsible for the prosecution of serious and high-profile fraud, terrorist, state security and special interest criminal matters, including the Stansted Airport Afghan airline hijacking and the prosecution of Paul Burrell, Princess Diana's butler. He has been recognised twice in the Lawyers' Top Hot 100 and been described as being top of the referral lists of many city firms for independent advice for directors. Michael has also been recommended as a leading individual on international sanctions by Who's Who Legal, Trade and Customs in 2021. So a big welcome to you, Michael. Thank you for joining us. If we start off, and you can give us a little bit of an overview of your career to date, and maybe one or two of the highlights that have stood out for you.
Thank you, Susan. So it's getting on for nearly 30 years ago that I qualified into the law. I went to university in Manchester, and then I came to London and did the bar. So I actually qualified as a barrister, and now I'm a solicitor. And when I qualified as a barrister, I went into government practice. As you said, I worked for the Crown Prosecution Service for 8 years. 5 years of that was working in South London, where pretty rough communities, and I was doing street crime, so rape, robbery, murder, those sorts of cases, lots of drugs cases, and prosecuting those from the ground up, so to speak. So from the least serious courts all the way through. We had a system within the Crown Prosecution Service in those days, not the same now, where you followed your cases from the lowest courts to the highest courts. I then did 3 years, as you've said, in a specialist unit. There were only a few of us, and we did sort of national security, terrorism, and special interest cases, which were absolutely fascinating. Every single one of them was extremely interesting. And I'll come on to talk a little bit later about why that experience was pretty formative. In 2002, I then left and I joined the firm I'm now the senior partner of, which is Peters & Peters. And as you said, Peters & Peters is a leading white-collar civil fraud commercial litigation firm in London. We have about 46 lawyers here working on pure litigation and fraud related mostly. And the vast majority of the work that we do is international in flavor. So we travel extensively. We have to engage with prosecuting agencies or claimant or defendants in multiple jurisdictions all over the world. Often we manage litigation in multiple jurisdictions, and I can talk a little bit about that as well. So in terms of highlights, you've mentioned a couple of the cases when I was prosecuting. Obviously, they were very, very difficult cases. The Stansted Hijacking was a plane that was hijacked by a group of Afghans, flown to London, was on the tarmac for 3 days. It came via Moscow. They had machine guns, grenades, and they were eventually all arrested. There's 14 of them were prosecuted at the Old Bailey for hijacking an aircraft and various terrorist offences. In my defence practice, I've done many, many cases involving negotiating with the US Department of Justice. I'm acting for a lead individual in a 1MDB fraud, which is a huge $7 billion fraud on the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, with lots of tentacles in many jurisdictions, including Australia. Currently, we are acting for a number of relatively high-profile Russians, but also various businesses who have found themselves with a great number of sanctions-related issues as a consequence of Western sanctions imposed on Russia following the unlawful invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. So it's a broad church in terms of a practice.
Absolutely. That sounds like a fascinating career. So most of the people that would be working at your firm would have similar backgrounds to yourself, or all very diverse and different?
Well, we're pretty diverse. So there's a number of former prosecutors who are here. There are a number of sort of what I'd call a sort of dyed-in-the-wall criminal defense lawyers who started out in the magistrates' courts and in the Crown courts representing people. We also have, an increasing number of people who are coming to us from the bigger firms, the Magic Circle firms, both in London and abroad. We have recruited from Australia, which is why this webinar is particularly interesting to me, because that's been a fascinating experience. We work with a number of white collar firms, and also a lot of Magic Circle and Silver Circle firms in London, who are big international firms who also have special relationships in Australia. And a number of the partners that I have worked with in some of those firms have been Australian by origin and came to the UK a few years ago and have established excellent reputations and excellent practices for themselves here in London.
Okay, so to do your type of work, I mean, your background as senior prosecutor seemed to be very kind of significant and very important in the work that you're doing now. So would you say that your background has been like ideal to kind of jump off that or to leverage off that, or you think that it doesn't necessarily, other people have got quite different backgrounds as well, as you were saying, so they might be from firms as well?
I think, Susan, that the fact that I was a prosecutor was probably quite important a few years ago. It's been a long time since I prosecuted, so I think it's becoming less of an issue. What I think is very important, particularly about the first 5 years of prosecuting, was that I was very young. I was in my early 20s. We were essentially thrown into the deep end. If you demonstrated any sort of work ethic and a moderate amount of ability, you got a huge amount of responsibility in those days. And I suspect it's probably still true to this day in all countries, and particularly also in Australia if you work for the government. So that was a great grounding in getting a lot of responsibility to progress cases, some of them very significant, at a very young age. So you learn how to deal with pressure. You learn how to make decisions relatively quickly. And ultimately, and I'll come back to this as well, you learn what is the critical aspect, I think, of being a successful lawyer, whether it's national or international, and that is judgment. You learn from your mistakes, and hopefully over time, you become a better and better lawyer of being able to exercise calm, rational judgment on behalf of your clients dealing with quite complex issues.
Okay, we might explore that a little bit later, but before we do that, I'm just interested to know about the travel component in your work. So being an international lawyer, what does that actually involve and what does that look like for you?
So in terms of travel, as I've said, the cases take us to many different places. Sometimes it's very, very intense. So for example, on the 1MDB case I was telling you about a couple of years ago, before COVID, we were traveling backwards and forwards to the Middle East probably every couple of weeks, and we did that for about 18 months. A few years before then, we were doing 3 large cartel cases, and that meant frequent meetings with the US Department of Justice or meetings with clients who were detained in the United States. We also, for example, flew to Australia. We went to Sydney for a week. We brought a client with us. We were interviewed by the ACCC in relation to a criminal cartel involving international airlines. These days, for my for personal reasons, I have tried to cut out, much of the sort of long haul travel that's concerned. But, many members of my firm were doing a big case in Africa. They are repeatedly flying down to Southern Africa. I was in Joburg just a couple of months ago for a meeting in relation to a client. And we are, backwards and forwards to various EU member states. We do a lot of work before the European Union courts, a lot of work in France, sort of Germany, those sorts of places. So it's unusual in our small firm for me to walk around the floor plate and find that all the partners and the associates are here. There'll always be a few of them who are on some international trip representing clients.
So it's important for you to be able to go and travel to those countries rather than obviously doing it through Zoom and meetings all the time. Is that's a critical part of getting the information gathering, and is that right? Like, I'd imagine that would be sounds quite exhausting, and particularly some of those countries that you're traveling to, they're not easy countries necessarily.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think that the travel will reduce as a consequence of Zoom, because clients won't necessarily think that it's necessary. They possibly won't want to pay for it because it's expensive. But at the same time, I think there is no substitute for sitting down with a client. If you're trying to get instructions on a sort of complex matter and try to work out exactly what's going on, you've got lots and lots of files and documents. For example, on the recent trip to South Africa, it was very important that we went because we were meeting with lawyers in South Africa. They've been working on the case for many years. They had all the files. We went to their offices. We were able to really get into the detail, brainstorm about what the possible legal options were in relation to this particular client. And that just simply couldn't have been done on Zoom. I mean, some of the stuff you can do on Zoom, and we're doing some of the Russian stuff on Zoom, obviously, because there are real travel limitations now as a consequence of sanctions. But I don't think there's any substitute for sitting face to face with people and really trying to understand what's going on.
I mean, because you're working across so many different jurisdictions, how do you get up to speed with that from a legislative perspective? How do you navigate that? Is that difficult, or I'm assuming it might not be?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it's relevant for those who are listening and thinking about having an international career. I wouldn't get bogged down worrying about, if I'm going to go to the Middle East, I need to understand what the law is in the Middle East. What we tend to do is we will instruct law firms who we know and trust are very good law firms in each of the jurisdictions where the clients have issues. So it's their primary responsibility to brief us on what the law is and how it might affect the particular client's situation. What we are trying to do in many cases is look at the sort of global strategy for sorting out a client's problems if they're in multiple jurisdictions. And what I would say about that, what is much more important, is rather than being bogged down in what is the law in Switzerland, what's the law in France, what's the law in the United States, it's actually being cognitive of what is going on in the world. So I think, and I say this to others who work here in this firm, very, very, very important to keep up to date with what's going on in the world in terms of current affairs. And the easiest way to do that, and it's what I do every single morning, is I read the Financial Times, just over a cup of coffee, 15 minutes. It never happens that I will read the Financial Times and find something and not find something in there that is of relevance. So if you look at today's, for example, obviously they've got the Australian election result on the front page. On page 2 of the FT is a whole story about Russians and the impact of Russian sanctions on litigation in London. So it's absolutely fascinating, and it's something that clients are very sophisticated, and they want their lawyers to demonstrate an understanding of current affairs wherever it is happening, because everything is interconnected in this world. Despite the fact that people say globalization is dead, I don't agree that that's the case in relation to law, because if you just look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has had implications in relation to Western powers coordinating on sanctions. It's going to have huge implications for the military industrial complex for the next 20 years and our security. For Australia, it will have implications in relation to Australia's security arrangements. And I know your Prime Minister is now going off to meet the Quad in Tokyo today. It'll have implications for China and Taiwan. It'll have implications on global food supply. All of these things have got huge legal ramifications, and international businesses and high net worth individuals need to understand where they fit and how their lawyers are going to be able to help them to navigate these changing times.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got so many questions. I don't know where to start. I just want to keep on firing them at you. But before we kind of talk a little bit about what you look for when you actually recruit, and I'd be interested to know some of the Australian lawyers in terms of their background. Just give us a bit of an overview of what is it about your career that is just driven you. I mean, it sounds so fascinating, but it also sounds quite tiring as well. So maybe just kind of give us a bit of a summary of like, what are the things that give you the greatest satisfaction, and then perhaps what are some of the challenges of having an international career?
So I think if I go back, this is a sort of slight sort of therapy session for me. If I go back in time, I grew up in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and the 1980s. So you cannot grow up in Northern Ireland during those times without being embroiled in politics, political discussion, political thinking. I did a degree in law and politics. And so I have been drawn to work which has a very significant political flavor. Now, what that means in terms of our practice is, as the world moves away from democracies, which it had done up until probably the 24th of February, I think that shift might now be changing. What you will see, and we are a little bit of a barometer for that in our firm, is that a lot of our work is moving east. So it's moving to Russia, to the Middle East, to India, to China, Malaysia, Indonesia. And one of the reasons for that is the countries where kleptocracy is on the rise, or where you've got very, very powerful leaders, they tend to have a habit of abusing the criminal justice system to target their political and commercial enemies. We see this all the time. So whether it's in Russia, as I said, or whether it's in the Middle East, or whether it's in Africa, wherever it might be. So it's the same playbook. You don't need to know the technical law. It's the same playbook, and you can then use the courts in London, or you can use international arbitration, or you can use the United Nations, or whatever it might be, to try to defend the interests of your clients. You can use Interpol to prevent them becoming fugitives. You can use the courts to fight extradition, in those sorts of cases. So in that sense, it's hugely interesting. As I say, it's challenging because for somebody who may just have a narrow practice area and thinking, gosh, I don't know if I can get into this, it might seem quite intimidating. But essentially, the decision making, whether it's in Azerbaijan, or whether it's in London, or whether it's in Melbourne or Sydney, the decision making is really the same mental process that takes place. The risks that arise are the same sorts of risks wherever it is that you're practicing, wherever it is that you're doing business. So once you sort of understand that, they understand the way the human mind works in these sort of situations and how to try to navigate, you can do this sort of work anywhere.
Okay. Now, thank you for that. That's really, really good to know. So for people that are thinking of packing up their bags and coming over to, say, the UK, tell us a little bit about the lawyers that you recruit and which ones stand out. And I'd also be interested just to get your perspective on when is a good time, perhaps, for someone to consider coming overseas. I mean, obviously now with the pandemic, people can start doing that, but how much experience do they need?
I think it's probably a good idea to get a couple of years of practice under your belt in Australia first. So obviously there will be practice areas which don't have so much of an international dimension to them. I'm thinking things like maybe like sort of family law, that kind of thing. But in relation to the sort of work that we do, just litigation generally, or competition law, corporate law, arbitration. First of all, what I would say, the good news is there is a real shortage in the London job market. And obviously, London is one of the prime legal centres in the world, if not the prime legal centre in the world. Many international arbitration agreements are written with London as the arbitration centre. Many contractual agreements are written subject to the law of England and Wales. So a lot of cases get litigated here or get settled here in London. So in the practice areas of sort of litigation, arbitration, law firms are crying out for young lawyers, young talented lawyers. As I say, I've come across a lot of Australian lawyers in the course of our practice, lawyers who come to our firm, lawyers who come to other firms. And I don't want to necessarily generalize too much, but what I have found is extremely open, extremely good communicators, extremely hardworking, proactive, rather than just sort of sitting back. They tend not to be very shy, if I can put it that way. They tend to speak their mind. They tend to speak their minds. I think these are all great positive qualities. This is what we're looking for. I think post-pandemic, amongst the younger generation, there's an anxiety about coming into the office. There's an anxiety about being too much on the front foot. We definitely look for those sorts of lawyers. We want people who are going to be proactive in all aspects of their legal work. And importantly, what I would be saying to somebody thinking about it is, research the London market, choose a few firms that you're particularly interested in, and really research those firms and understand what they do. But more than that, one of the things that really makes candidates stand out for me is that when we're interviewing, if you've not just thought about the firm and what the firm is doing, but think about what you can do, what you can bring to the firm.
Yes.
I think a lot of reliance at the moment on when we interview people, sometimes they think, well, what's the firm going to do for me? I would definitely turn that around, a bit like JFK's inauguration speech. Ask not what the firm can do for you, ask what you can do for the firm.
Yeah.
So really important. Think about business development. Think about, well, where does the work come from for a firm like Peters & Peters, or even some of these bigger firms? Where do they get their work? How can I help with that? Do I have contacts because I'm Australian? Do I have contacts in law firms in Australia? Can I write an article about the overlap between what happens in Australia and what happens in the UK? Can I help this firm to expand into the Eastern market where there is a lot of activity? Those are the sorts of things that I'd be thinking about. But primarily, it's about, I think it was Warren Buffett who said, when he was asked a question about, what should I do? He said, the most important thing is to invest in yourself. Everybody is a brand. So how do you build your own brand? And how do you invest in yourself? And don't rely on other people so much. You do stuff yourself off your own back. I think that's the sorts of qualities that we're looking for. And lots of law firms get very obsessed by academic qualifications. We don't do that here. What we look for are is people with good judgment. People who are what I would describe as smart at life.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Smart at life. In other words, they exercise the same judgment when they're queuing up for a coffee as they do when they're talking to a client. So they don't get stressed out. They are calm, rational, reasonable. They use charm to get the things that they want in life. And essentially they exercise good judgment in every situation that they are in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked what you were talking about before as well. Like, I mean, your interest in politics. So it's also being interested in the world around us as well. So kind of looking, perhaps thinking broader and bigger, and not necessarily only through the eyes of a lawyer, but kind of beyond that. So I like that. That's smart at life. That's really a good tagline. What are languages something that you think would be useful, or they're just like a nice thing to have, but they're certainly not a critical thing?
I don't find that they're absolutely critical. I know this might sound rather sort of backward looking, but English is the most spoken language in the world, and in the legal community, obviously it's the critical language. I mean, it's obviously helpful to be able to speak other languages, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, whatever it might be, but that's pretty unusual. But we do have people here who speak many different languages in our firm, and obviously in some situations it's hugely helpful. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a massive plus for what we do, because English is obviously so critical across multiple jurisdictions.
Okay, but some of the other skills you mentioned as well. So also experience in maybe one of those areas of law that you mentioned before would be a positive thing as well. So maybe someone that's got a few years post-admission experience behind them, or would you prefer people that are maybe like later on in their career?
I don't think it really matters too much.
Yeah.
And in terms of the experience, I wouldn't want anyone watching this to think, oh, well, in order to go to a firm like the firm Michael's describing, I've got to do a couple of years of criminal law in Australia. I don't actually think that's necessary, because, as I say, what we're looking for are people who've got good judgment. We recruited somebody a few years ago from Australia who had not done any criminal law, and she turned out to be very successful, and she went on to have and continues to have a very good career. So it's really, as I say, it's more about, are you going to be hardworking? Are you going to be sort of open, active, proactive, able to get into the sort of nuts and bolts of cases and get on well with clients in difficult circumstances? Those are really the skills that we're
How much can you do from at home? Say if you're in Australia and you're wanting to come, I mean, in terms of developing those relationships and speaking to recruiters, would you recommend that you start doing that now from your home country, as opposed to jumping on a plane, taking a bit of a risk and just playing it by ear a bit, living dangerously?
Well, I would definitely advise researching the market. And yes, speaking to recruiters or speaking to friends who've done it, or whatever it might be. I would also start thinking about what sort of area of law I might be interested in doing, and then starting to build your own brand a little bit. So maybe writing articles, writing blogs, just showing the wider world that you've actually got a real interest and a real appetite in a particular area, rather than just you're rather than being opportunistic. You've got to show that you're investing in it, and you have invested in it for a certain amount of time. So obviously that's quite difficult to do if you're a student. Not impossible, but it's more difficult. But once if you get a position in an Australian law firm and you're working in a particular area, it will be very, very good later on, if you decide to come to London, to be able to show, well, this is obviously I did my job in this firm, but I also did this in terms of writing or speaking or whatever it might be, to further my own interest in a particular area and further my own brand.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. That's great. Just a couple of last questions. What do you think are some of the challenges of an overseas career? I know you've kind of touched on them, but for those that are a bit undecided, yeah.
Well, obviously the big challenge is Australia is a very long way away, and family and friends can seem very cut off. That's easier now with Zoom. So that's slightly less of a problem, but I think it still is a big issue for quite a lot of Australians who come to London. Their heartstrings are pulling them back over time. Secondly, I think, and this touches on something I was saying a little bit earlier, I do still think that some firms feel that Australia is very much at the sort of periphery of world events in terms of what's going on, and therefore they don't, not really in the hub and won't really have had a grounding in kind of, international developments. So that's why I think it's pretty important to be able to show that you do have that understanding, you are keeping up to date with what's happening in the world, and it's not just hunkering down in Australia and just thinking about Australian issues, particularly because Australia was very closed over COVID, and that might have exacerbated that state of mind. But I definitely think that this is Australia's time. I think that over the next 20 or 30 years, it's quite clear that the way in which the world is moving, the Pacific is going to become the major part of world interest, whether it's in economics, with the rise of China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, with security concerns. We've seen all these agreements being put in place more recently. That also with mining, obviously in Western Australia, it's becoming a huge issue with the shortages that we have of particular precious metals go into mobile phones and go into conductors for cars, etc. So I think Australia is going to become very important jurisdiction. So to be able to have a foot in Australia and a foot in somewhere like London, for being able to demonstrate to clients you understand the issues in both jurisdictions, I think it could be hugely beneficial to people's careers.
Thank you. That's really good. That's great advice. Just a last question for you. Anything that you would tell your younger self? Anything in terms of kind of advice, or I wish I did this, or I wish I did that? Any kind of advice to a younger version of yourself?
Gosh, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think don't give up. Don't get disillusioned. We all have difficult times. We all get knocked off course, whether it's in our professional or personal lives. But I definitely think you've got to just, and I know this is a bit of a cliche, you do have to accept when bad things happen. Sometimes it takes a bit of time for the bruising to heal, but you do have to dust yourself off, get back up, and you really do have to be confident in your own judgment and your own ability to be able to succeed. And as I say, if you do exercise good judgment, if you're a good person, it really does shine through. If you're collegiate and hardworking, and you are conscientious, then I think that you'll have no difficulty in being successful in whatever it is that one turns one's mind to. And if I sort of wish I had told myself that when I was 21. It might have helped deal with a lot of unnecessary soul searching.
Yeah. I think one of our other panelists said also that your heart has to be in it as well in law. Like, it's not a profession that you can do just half-heartedly. I think that you've definitely got to be driven by it and the good that you're doing as well. So that seems like that's a big theme. I don't know, that I'm kind of getting from listening to your story in terms of, making a huge difference, and in terms of the world and all that goes on, and the fact that it's an unfair world as well. Very
just standing outside law generally, this is a comment that's applicable to everybody. There was a survey done recently. I think there was some horrible statistic that sort of 60+% of people do not feel invested in the work that they do. They're just going through the motions. So I definitely think if you have the ability to do something that you're interested in, that's what you should try to do, because that is definitely going to drive you to limits and exceeding the limits by comparison with other people, and it's going to fundamentally make you feel a greater sense of fulfillment.
And if it doesn't come straight away, it's just be patient, and it will come. as well. So yeah, there's definitely that. You might not necessarily start off exactly where you want to be, but it can come if you're really determined. Yeah. All right. Look, I'd like to thank you, Michael, so much for being a panelist and for sharing your insights and sharing your perspective. I think that those listening will take away many words of wisdom and lots of encouragement to give it a go. So thank you very much.
My great pleasure, Susan. Nice to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.